Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim is a new anime fantasy project that was just released in theaters over this past weekend. This film was directed by Kenji Kamiyama, and it features voice talent like Brian Cox and Miranda Otto, who played Eowyn in the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, Luke Pasqualino, and Gaia, I can't remember her last name, but her name is Gaia, and she voices a character in this movie named Hera. So the story here is taken from the appendices of the Lord of the Rings, and it is about Helm Hammerhand, the legendary king of Rohan. It's about him, it's about his family, and it's about them involved in a bit of a conflict with other members of this kingdom. The main character of the story is Hera, of course, and she is caught in the middle when a character named Wolf decides to lead an attack against the kingdom of Rohan, specifically against Helm Hammerhand and his legion. She and her people have to escape to the Hornburg, which will eventually become Helm's Deep as we know it in the Lord of the Rings lore. And thus you have a personal conflict with a lot of vengeance and tragedy, fighting, and just a lot of Lord of the Rings stuff. It's a Lord of the Rings story. I'm a huge Tolkien fan. I've read the books. I have watched pretty much everything Lord of the Rings since I was a little kid. I know what you're gonna say. You're gonna come into this review, you're gonna be like, how can I take anything you say seriously? Because it seems like every time Lord of the Rings is involved, you just... I will admit that I am a glazer for Lord of the Rings. I will admit that I am their whore, I am their bitch. That doesn't mean I'm not going to be honest and fair, because I'm honest and fair, I'd like to think, in almost all of my reviews, regardless of how big of a fan I am of the IP. I was interested in seeing a new story that takes place in the same world of Middle-earth. A story that can tell its own story and doesn't have to rely on everything else that we know. And for that part, I do want to single this movie out because it tells a story that feels self-contained. I say self-contained in the sense that, yes, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, you're going to see stuff in here that reminds you of the books. You're going to see stuff in here, references to the movies, Peter Jackson movies, like all of that is in here. But it's telling a story about something else that happened in the lore, and it doesn't feel like this big world-ending thing. Like, it's not about the rings, it's not about Sauron, it's about this family and this feud that fuels this gigantic conflict that takes place in this specific area of Lord of the Rings. But all the voice talent in this movie is really good. I love Gaia, I love her voice as Hera, I love the strength and the determination and the fire that she plays her with. The guy who voiced Wolf was also really good. I think I said his name was Luke Pasqualini or something. Like, he was pretty solid. I really enjoyed his performance too. It was nice to hear from Miranda Otter. She's basically narrating the story. Again, she plays Eowyn in the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, so it was nice to hear her voice come back. But hands down, the person who steals the show from a voice acting standpoint was Brian Cox. Brian Cox, he voices Helm Hammerhand, and holy shit, Brian Cox and the power and the command that he voices this character with, I mean, oh my god, chef's kiss. It was really awesome stuff. Also, if you're going into this movie expecting action, good, because there's a shit ton of action in this movie. In fact, some might say an overload of action. I'm not gonna call it Battle of Five Armies type of action where it's just like the action is endless and exhausting, but there is a lot more action in this movie than even I thought there would be. And I thought most of that was actually helmed pretty good. Helmed. You like what I did there? Helm hammer. Yeah, I know, it's pretty bad. The action scenes are awesome, and almost all of the characters have a moment or two, a badass moment, kind of like the Fellowship in the original Lord of the Rings movies. If you're a Lord of the Rings fan, it's gonna have some of that. You're gonna have some epic action, you're gonna have some good voice acting, and overall, I think you'd have a solid enough time watching it. Unfortunately, this movie actually comes across as a little bit disappointing, and it's not that it's a bad movie, it's just not nearly as good as I think it should have been. There's a reason why I didn't say anything about the animation in the positive side of the video, because I actually had a big issue with the animation. I know that everybody involved in creating the animation for this, there was a lot of motion capture for 2D animation, and then they converted it into 3D animation. They used the 3D animation for the environment and the camera movements. That's not to short any of the animators or the visual effects artists who worked on this. I'm sure they worked hard, and there are some beautiful shots scattered throughout the movie for sure. Overall, the animation to me just felt very stiff. It felt very rigid. It didn't really fit. It felt jarring when you compared it to the environment that it's around. Me personally, I feel like if the environment is going to feel like a 3D thing and then the animation is 2D, I want the animation to feel a little bit more fluid. Also wasn't very detailed when you looked at the wide shots and you saw the rendering of whole crowds of armies. Some of that just made the animation stand out as one of the weaker aspects of the film. I love anime and I love anime style generally speaking, but I just didn't think it fit with the animation for this story that they were trying to tell. Also, while it's cool to have some deep lore cuts and some interesting Easter eggs and references and stuff. I do feel like there are parts of this movie that feel a little bit too familiar, that are going to be a little bit too referential. Parts from the Lord of the Rings books and movies that feel so identical and feel like you're watching the same scene just with different characters. There is a little bit of that going around in this movie. Biggest issue with this movie is that I felt like, especially in the second half of the movie, it feels very emotionally flat. When I say emotionally flat, what I mean is that I feel like the movie did not do enough to justify or explain or flesh out this conflict between Wolf and between Hera. A large portion of the story rests on this relationship and on this conflict, and unfortunately, the movie did not do nearly enough to justify that conflict. You feel like there should have been a whole other side to their relationship, and you're just not given a lot of context for it. Wolf and his plight and some of the crazy shit that he's doing in this movie. I also had no idea how to feel about Hera beyond the whole, like, I'm my own woman and I don't want to marry anybody thing. Like, I get that. In general, this just kind of craters the movie and makes it feel like something that I'm just watching instead of something that I feel emotionally invested in. When you're taking a character in Hera who was not really defined or really given a lot of background or detail in the appendices, and you're making that character a bigger character and making them a bigger focal point of this story, I feel like you gotta justify it by making me feel more emotionally invested. Overall, I didn't, especially when it came to her and Wolf. The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim was a solid watch, and I'm gonna leave this one in the Daily Planet. It was good, and I'd recommend you watch it, but if you want to skip it or wait, I understand that decision, and I can't be mad at you. Give me your favorite fantasy adaptation of all time. Please like and subscribe to The Superfan Show, and if you like what you see, tell me how you feel, and stay tuned to hear more from the Man of Steel. Peace.